Have you ever witnessed someone being completely humiliated in public, only to watch them rise from the ashes in the most unexpected way? What you're about to read is not just another royal story. It's about pride, prejudice, and the moment when true character reveals itself under the harshest spotlight. Picture this: a world-renowned pianist, drunk on his own success, decides to publicly mock a member of the British royal family. He thought he knew everything about talent, about worth, about who deserves respect. He was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. This is the true story of how Prince William faced his greatest public humiliation and turned it into his most triumphant moment. It's about how sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones who surprise us beyond our wildest imagination. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared millions of times across social media, and would forever change how the world saw both men involved. One man's arrogance would crumble, while another's hidden talent would shine brighter than anyone ever expected. Are you ready to discover what really happened when Prince William stepped up to prove his worth? The story you're about to read will make you question everything you think you know about talent, humility, and the power of never giving up. The Royal Albert Hall buzzed with excitement on that crisp October evening in 2019. The grand venue, with its distinctive red brick exterior and magnificent dome, had hosted countless legendary performances over its 150-year history. Tonight was different. Tonight was special. The annual Royal Charity Gala for Children in Need was about to begin, and the guest list read like a who's who of British society. Prince William arrived at exactly 7:30, stepping out of his official car into a sea of camera flashes. He wore a perfectly tailored black dinner jacket, his blonde hair neatly styled, and that familiar warm smile that had charmed the nation for decades. As second in line to the throne, William had attended hundreds of such events, but this one held particular significance. He had personally chosen to support this charity after visiting children's hospitals across the country and seeing firsthand the struggles many families faced. The prince made his way through the crowd of distinguished guests, stopping to shake hands and exchange pleasantries. Cabinet ministers, business leaders, celebrities, and philanthropists all waited eagerly for a moment of his attention. William moved with the practiced ease of someone born into public life, yet there was something different about him tonight. Those who knew him well noticed a certain nervousness, a subtle tension that wasn't usually present at these formal gatherings. Inside the magnificent circular auditorium, over 5,000 guests took their seats. The venue's famous red and gold interior gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, while the massive pipe organ stood majestically behind the stage. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. This wasn't just another fundraising dinner with speeches and silent auctions. Tonight promised world-class entertainment from some of Britain's most talented performers. As the evening's host, the charming television presenter Sarah Lancashire took to the stage to welcome everyone. Prince William settled into his reserved seat in the royal box. He could see the entire audience from his elevated position, their faces turned expectantly toward the stage below. The first few performances were spectacular. A renowned soprano delivered a breathtaking rendition of Ave Maria, followed by a contemporary dance troupe that left the audience in stunned silence before erupting into thunderous applause. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Sarah Lancashire's voice echoed through the hall as she introduced the evening's headline act. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of the world's most celebrated pianists, a man who has graced the stages of Carnegie Hall, the Sydney Opera House, and La Scala. Winner of the prestigious Chopin competition and holder of 3 Grammy Awards, Mr. Victor Kozlov. The applause was deafening as Victor Kozlov strode onto the stage. At 45 years old, he cut an imposing figure in his perfectly pressed white dinner jacket. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes that seemed to survey the audience with a mixture of confidence and disdain. Kozlov had earned his reputation not just for his extraordinary musical talent, but also for his controversial opinions and sharp tongue. Born in Moscow to a family of musicians, Kozlov had been playing piano since he was 3 years old. His talent was evident from the beginning, and by age 16, he was performing with major orchestras across Europe. His rise to international fame had been meteoric, but it had also inflated his ego to astronomical proportions. He was known in classical music circles for his cutting remarks about fellow musicians, and his belief that true musical genius was reserved for a select few. As Kozlov adjusted the piano bench and flexed his fingers. He glanced up at the royal box where Prince William sat. A smirk crossed his face, so subtle that most of the audience missed it entirely. But those sitting nearby noticed it, and they would remember it for what came next. Before I begin tonight's performance, Kozlov announced, his accented English carrying clearly through the hall's exceptional acoustics, I would like to dedicate this evening to the pursuit of true artistic excellence. His eyes remained fixed on the royal box as he spoke. In a world where people are celebrated simply for their birth circumstances rather than their actual talents, it is refreshing to remember that music cannot be inherited. It must be earned. An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the audience. Several people shifted in their seats, unsure whether Kozlov was making a general philosophical point or something more pointed. Prince William maintained his composure, his expression neutral, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes. Kozlov began his performance with Chopin's Ballade No. 1, his fingers dancing across the keys with technical perfection. The music was undeniably beautiful, each note crystal clear and precisely timed. The audience was mesmerized, drawn into the complex emotional landscape that Chopin had created nearly 2 centuries earlier. Kozlov's interpretation was flawless, showcasing the years of training and natural talent that had made him famous worldwide. As the piece concluded, the hall erupted in enthusiastic applause. Kozlov stood and bowed deeply, soaking in the adulation. But instead of leaving the stage, he remained at the piano, raising his hand for silence. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying that same undertone of smugness. "You know, it takes decades to master pieces like this. Decades of study, practice, and natural ability that cannot simply be taught to anyone." Again, his gaze drifted toward the royal box. Some people believe that privilege can substitute for talent, but the piano is an honest instrument. It reveals the truth about who possesses genuine ability and who does not. The discomfort in the room was now palpable. Many guests were looking toward Prince William, wondering how he would respond to what was clearly becoming a personal attack. The prince remained seated, his hands folded calmly in his lap, but there was something different in his expression now. What had been polite attention was transforming into something more focused, more determined. Kozlov continued his performance with a piece by Rachmaninoff, his technical skill undeniable, but his arrogance growing more apparent with each passing minute. During the brief pause between movements, he spoke again to the audience. "I often wonder," he said, seemingly addressing the entire hall, but his words clearly aimed at one person, what it would sound like if someone without proper training attempted to play such complex music. Perhaps someone who has spent their time cutting ribbons and attending garden parties rather than practicing scales. A few nervous laughs echoed from the audience, but most people remained silent, shocked by the pianist's boldness. Prince William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had faced criticism before, had dealt with media scrutiny and public questioning of his role and worth. But this was different. This was a direct, public challenge to his character and abilities in front of some of the most influential people in Britain. The charitable cause they were supposed to be supporting was being overshadowed by one man's ego and deliberate provocation. As Kozlov launched into the final section of the Rachmaninoff piece, his performance became even more dramatic, his body swaying with the music as if he were channeling the composer himself. The technical brilliance was undeniable, but there was something cold about it, something that prioritized perfection over genuine emotion. When the piece ended, the applause was more restrained than before. The audience was clearly uncomfortable with the tension that had developed, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. Charity galas were supposed to be pleasant, unifying events where everyone came together for a good cause. This was turning into something entirely different. Kozlov stood once more, his smile now openly mocking. "Perhaps," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet hall, "we should invite others to demonstrate their musical abilities. After all, if privilege truly equals talent, surely any member of our distinguished audience could sit down and play with similar skill." His eyes locked directly on Prince William as he said these words, the challenge unmistakable. The entire audience turned to look at the royal box, waiting to see how the prince would respond to this extraordinary breach of protocol and common decency. Prince William stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. The hall fell completely silent, thousands of people holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. The prince's face remained calm, but there was something new in his eyes now, a spark of determination that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Kozlov," Williams said, his clear voice carrying perfectly through the acoustics of the historic venue. "That is a very interesting proposition." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. "Perhaps you would be willing to make room for another performance this evening." The silence that followed was profound. In all his years of public appearances, Prince William had never done anything like this. He was known for his diplomatic approach, his ability to defuse tension with humor and grace. But tonight was different. Tonight, Viktor Kozlov had pushed too far, and Prince William was about to show the world something nobody expected. As the prince began to make his way toward the stage, the whispers started. People pulled out their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sarah Lancashire, still standing at the side of the stage, looked absolutely stunned, clearly unsure how to handle this unprecedented situation. Kozlov's expression had changed as well. What had been smug confidence was now edged with uncertainty. He had expected the prince to either ignore his provocations or respond with some diplomatic deflection. He had not expected this direct acceptance of his challenge. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be talked about for years to come. In one corner stood Viktor Kozlov, one of the world's most celebrated classical pianists, armed with decades of professional training and multiple international awards. In the other corner was Prince William, a man who had spent his life in public service but was about to reveal a side of himself that the world had never seen. As Prince William reached the steps leading up to the stage, the entire Royal Albert Hall held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen when privilege met talent, when humility faced arrogance, and when one man's public challenge was about to receive an answer that nobody saw coming. The tension in the Royal Albert Hall was electric as Prince William climbed the steps to the stage. Every footstep echoed through the massive venue, amplified by the absolute silence of 5,000 spectators who couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing. This wasn't supposed to happen at charity galas. Members of the royal family didn't engage in public confrontations with arrogant performers. They smiled politely, applauded appropriately, and maintained their dignity above all else. But tonight was different. As William reached the stage level, Viktor Kozlov's expression shifted from smugness to something approaching nervousness. The pianist had built his career not just on musical excellence, but on psychological manipulation. He was famous for intimidating other musicians, for making cutting remarks that left his targets flustered and defeated. But the man walking toward him now showed no signs of intimidation. Instead, there was a calm determination in Prince William's bearing that Kozlov hadn't expected. Sarah Lancashire, still holding her microphone, looked absolutely bewildered. As an experienced television presenter, she had handled unexpected moments before, but nothing quite like this. She glanced between the prince and the pianist, clearly unsure whether she should intervene or simply let this extraordinary situation unfold. Prince William reached the center of the stage and turned to face Viktor Kozlov. The pianist was still standing beside the grand piano, his white dinner jacket now seeming less impressive against the prince's quiet confidence. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other while the audience watched in fascination. "Mr. Kozlov," Williams said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall without any amplification, "you seem to have strong opinions about the relationship between privilege and talent. I find myself curious about your theory." Kozlov's smirk returned, though it seemed less certain than before. "Your Royal Highness," he replied, emphasizing the title with just a hint of mockery. "I simply believe that true artistic ability comes from years of dedicated study and natural gift. These cannot be purchased or inherited, regardless of one's position in society." The audience was completely riveted. Many people were recording with their phones now, sensing that they were witnessing a historic moment. In the royal box, other members of the royal party looked on with expressions ranging from concern to fascination. William nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering Kozlov's words. "An interesting perspective," he said. "And you believe that someone like myself, having not attended conservatory, could not possibly possess such ability?" "I believe," Kozlov said, his confidence returning as he felt he was back in familiar territory, "that dilettantes often mistake their amateur efforts for genuine talent. The piano is a demanding mistress that requires complete devotion." A murmur went through the audience. Several people gasped audibly at the pianist's continued rudeness. This was no longer subtle provocation. It was open insult directed at the future King of England. Prince William's expression remained calm, but Those who knew him well could see something stirring behind his eyes. "I see," he said quietly. "Then, perhaps you would be willing to test your theory this evening." Kozlov's eyebrows raised. He had been hoping to provoke a reaction, to embarrass the prince and demonstrate his own superiority, but he hadn't expected such a direct challenge. "Are you suggesting that you would like to perform?" he asked, unable to keep a note of disbelief from his voice. "I am," William replied simply. The audience erupted in whispers and exclamations. This was unprecedented. Members of the royal family simply didn't engage in public musical competitions with world-renowned artists. It was unthinkable, undignified, and absolutely fascinating. Kozlov looked momentarily stunned, then broke into what he clearly intended to be a gracious smile. "Your Royal Highness, I would be honored to hear your interpretation of whatever piece you feel comfortable attempting." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He was already savoring what he assumed would be an embarrassing amateur performance that would prove his point about privilege versus talent. Prince William walked over to the magnificent grand piano that dominated the stage. It was a Steinway Model D concert grand, the same type used in the world's most prestigious venues. The instrument gleamed under the stage lights, its ebony surface reflecting the ornate ceiling of the Royal Albert Hall. As William approached the piano bench, he removed his dinner jacket and handed it to Sarah Lancashire, who accepted it with an expression of complete bewilderment. He rolled up his sleeves slightly and sat down at the piano, adjusting the bench to his preferred height. The hall had fallen completely silent again. Every person present was straining to see and hear what would happen next. In living rooms across Britain, people who had been watching the live television broadcast were calling friends and family to tell them to turn on their TVs immediately. William placed his hands on the keys, his posture straight but relaxed. He closed his eyes for a moment, seeming to center himself, then opened them and began to play. The first notes that emerged from the piano were soft, tentative, as if he were testing the instrument. Kozlov's smirk widened. This was exactly what he had expected, the hesitant, uncertain playing of someone who had perhaps taken a few lessons as a child, but possessed no real skill. But then something changed. As William's fingers found their rhythm, the tentative notes transformed into something more confident. He was playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9, No. 2, one of the composer's most beloved pieces. The melody floated through the hall with a warmth and emotion that immediately captivated the audience. Kozlov's expression began to shift. The piece William was playing was technically challenging, requiring not just finger dexterity but genuine musical understanding. The prince's interpretation was not that of a beginner or even an intermediate player. His phrasing was sophisticated, his touch varied and expressive. As the piece continued, the audience found themselves leaning forward in their seats. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Prince William wasn't just competent, he was genuinely talented. His playing had a lyrical quality that spoke to the heart of Chopin's romantic style. The pianist who had moments before been so confident in his superiority now watched with growing amazement and concern. William's technique was solid, his interpretation mature and emotionally resonant. This was not the playing of a dilettante or someone who had simply taken a few casual lessons. When William reached the piece's famous middle section, where the melody becomes more ornamented and technically demanding, his performance became even more impressive. His fingers navigated the complex passages with ease, never losing the essential singing quality that makes this nocturne so beloved. Kozlov found himself studying William's hand position, his pedaling technique, his overall approach to the instrument. Everything he saw indicated serious training, the kind that could only come from years of dedicated study. But when had the future King of England found time for such intensive musical education? The audience was completely mesmerized. Many people who had come expecting a pleasant evening of fundraising and light entertainment were witnessing something extraordinary. Prince William's performance was not just technically proficient, it was deeply musical, showing an understanding of Chopin's style that spoke to genuine artistry. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, William's playing became even more expressive. The final restatement of the main melody was delivered with a tenderness that brought tears to many eyes in the audience. When the last notes faded away, the silence that followed was profound. Then, the applause began. It started slowly, with just a few people clapping, then built into a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Royal Albert Hall. People were on their feet, cheering and applauding with an enthusiasm that far exceeded what they had shown for Kozlov's admittedly impressive, but emotionally cold performance. Prince William stood up from the piano bench, looking slightly embarrassed by the response. He was not accustomed to being applauded for his musical abilities rather than his royal status. The warmth and genuine appreciation of the audience clearly moved him. Viktor Kozlov stood frozen beside the piano, his face a mask of shock and confusion. Everything he thought he knew about talent, training, and the relationship between privilege and ability had just been challenged by a performance that defied his assumptions. Sarah Lancashire finally found her voice. "Your Royal Highness," she said into her microphone, her words carrying through the hall as the applause finally began to die down. "That was absolutely magnificent. I think I speak for everyone here when I say we had no idea." William smiled, that familiar warm expression that had endeared him to the public for years. "Thank you," he said simply. "Music has always been important to me." The understatement of the century, thought many in the audience. What they had just witnessed was not the result of casual interest or occasional dabbling. This was the product of serious study and genuine talent. Kozlov finally found his voice. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his earlier arrogance completely absent. "I must say, that was unexpected. Your technique is quite accomplished." It was a grudging admission, but an admission nonetheless. The man who had spent the evening insulting Prince William's abilities had just been forced to acknowledge that his assumptions were completely wrong. But William wasn't finished. As the applause finally died down completely, and people began to settle back into their seats, the prince remained standing beside the piano. There was something in his expression that suggested this evening was far from over. "Mr. Kozlov," William said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall, "I appreciate your acknowledgement. But I believe you suggested that privilege cannot substitute for talent. Perhaps we should explore that proposition a bit further." A new tension filled the air. The audience sensed that what they had just witnessed was only the beginning of something much larger. Kozlov's face went pale as he realized that Prince William was not going to simply accept his grudging compliment and leave the stage. The challenge that the pianist had issued so arrogantly was being turned back on him, and he was about to discover that he had severely underestimated the man he had tried to humiliate. The atmosphere in the Royal Albert Hall had completely transformed. What had begun as an elegant charity gala was now something unprecedented in royal history. Prince William stood beside the grand piano, his sleeves rolled up, and his usual diplomatic demeanor replaced by something more direct and purposeful. Viktor Kozlov, meanwhile, looked like a man who was beginning to realize he had made a terrible mistake. "Mr. Kozlov," William continued, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone that made the entire audience lean forward to catch every word. "You seem to believe that true musical ability can only come from formal conservatory training. I'm curious about the foundation of that belief." The pianist shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence crumbling. "Well, Your Royal Highness, the great masters all studied under recognized teachers, followed established methods." "Indeed," William interrupted gently. "And where did you study, if you don't mind my asking?" Kozlov straightened slightly, seeming to find some comfort in familiar territory. "I was trained at the Moscow Conservatory under Professor Elena Richter, then continued my studies at Juilliard with the legendary maestro Carlos Herrera. I have certificates from both institutions." William nodded appreciatively. "Impressive credentials. Professor Richter is indeed legendary. I believe she studied under Heinrich Neuhaus, who taught some of the greatest pianists of the 20th century." The audience watched this exchange with fascination. This wasn't the typical diplomatic small talk they expected from royal encounters. Prince William was demonstrating a knowledge of classical music pedagogy that surprised everyone, including Kozlov. "You know Professor Richter's lineage?" Kozlov asked, clearly caught off guard. "I know it well," William replied. "I also know that she left Moscow in 1991 and moved to London, where she took a very small number of private students. Very exclusive, very expensive. She was quite selective about who she would teach." A strange expression crossed Kozlov's face. "Yes, she was. How do you know so much about her teaching history?" Prince William's expression grew more serious. "Because, Mr. Kozlov, Professor Elena Richter was my piano teacher for 12 years. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. It was as if the entire audience had collectively held its breath. People looked at each other in amazement. Then, back at the stage where this impossible conversation was taking place, Kozlov's face went completely white. That's impossible." Professor Richter never mentioned teaching any member of the royal family. She was very private about her students. She was indeed, William agreed. She insisted on complete confidentiality. No publicity, no recognition, no acknowledgement of her association with the royal household. It was a condition of her teaching contract that was strictly honored. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Elena Richter was considered one of the finest piano teachers in the world. Her former students included prize winners from the Van Cliburn competition, the Chopin competition, and numerous other international contests. If Prince William had indeed studied under her for 12 years, his performance that evening made perfect sense. Sarah Lancashire found her voice again. Your Royal Highness, are you saying that you've been studying piano seriously since childhood? William turned to address both her and the audience. I began studying with Professor Richter when I was 8 years old. She came to Kensington Palace twice a week for lessons that lasted 3 hours each session. By the time I was 18, I was practicing 4 hours a day whenever my schedule permitted. The audience was stunned. This meant that Prince William had received the same caliber of training as the world's greatest concert pianists. His technical foundation was not that of an amateur or hobbyist, but of someone groomed for professional performance. Kozlov was struggling to process this information. But why? Why would you pursue such intensive training if you weren't planning a career in music? William's expression softened slightly. Because my mother believed that music was essential for understanding beauty, emotion, and human connection. She insisted that both Harry and I learn to play instruments seriously. She said that someone who would one day serve the people should understand what moves the human spirit. The mention of Princess Diana brought a hush over the audience. Many people were now seeing Prince William's musical education not as a hobby, but as part of his preparation for his future role as king. It was a side of royal training that had never been publicly revealed. Professor Richter taught me that music is a language that transcends social boundaries, William continued. She said that when you sit at a piano, your title doesn't matter. Only your understanding, your technique, and your ability to communicate emotion through sound. Kozlov looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the full extent of his error. I had no idea, but, surely, with your royal duties. I continued studying until Professor Richter's death 4 years ago, William said quietly. She was 91 and still teaching. In her final months, she made me promise to continue playing, to honor what she had taught me about the responsibility that comes with musical ability. This revelation hit the audience like a physical blow. Many people were now viewing the evening's events in an entirely different light. What had seemed like an amateur's lucky performance was actually the result of decades of world-class training under one of the most respected teachers in classical music. But William wasn't finished. Mr. Kozlov, you mentioned earlier that you studied under Professor Richter at Moscow Conservatory. I'm curious about when that was, exactly. Kozlov's discomfort was now clearly visible. Well, it was during my undergraduate years, from 1989 to 1993. William nodded slowly. That's interesting, because Professor Richter left Moscow permanently in early 1991. She never returned to teach there after that date. The silence that followed was deafening. Kozlov's face had gone from white to red as the implication of William's words sank in. The audience was beginning to realize they were witnessing something more than just a musical confrontation. Furthermore, William continued, his voice still calm but carrying unmistakable authority. I have Professor Richter's complete teaching records, which she bequeathed to me upon her death. I've reviewed them carefully, and your name appears nowhere in her files from any period of her career. The audience gasped audibly. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Viktor Kozlov, the internationally celebrated pianist who had built his reputation partly on his supposed connection to legendary teachers, had apparently fabricated at least part of his educational background. Kozlov opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling to find words. There must be some mistake. Perhaps the records are incomplete. The records are quite complete, William said firmly. Professor Richter was meticulous about documentation. Every student she ever taught, from her early days in Moscow to her final years in London, is carefully catalogued. The tension in the hall was now unbearable. What had begun as a musical challenge was turning into something much more serious. Kozlov's credibility, his reputation, his entire career was being called into question in front of thousands of witnesses and television cameras. Your Royal Highness, Kozlov said desperately. Surely there's been some confusion. William walked over to Sarah Lancashire and quietly asked to borrow her microphone. When she handed it to him, He addressed the audience directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unexpected turn of events. When Professor Richter died, she left me not only her teaching records but also recordings of her students' performances over the years. Mr. Kozlov's claims about studying under her are particularly puzzling because she kept audio recordings of every lesson she taught from 1975 onward. The audience was now completely silent, hanging on every word. This had gone far beyond a simple musical disagreement. But let me return to the original challenge that Mr. Kozlov presented. William continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. He suggested that privilege cannot substitute for talent, and that the piano reveals the truth about genuine ability. I agree completely with that assessment. He turned back to Kozlov, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool temperature in the hall. However, I would like to propose a different test of talent and training. Mr. Kozlov, you are clearly an accomplished pianist regardless of any discrepancies in your educational claims. Would you be willing to join me in a demonstration of sight reading ability? Sight reading, the ability to play music perfectly upon first glance without any prior practice, was considered one of the truest tests of musical training and natural ability. It was a skill that could not be faked or compensated for through memorization. Kozlov's face went pale again. Sight reading was his weakness, something he had managed to avoid in his career by focusing on prepared repertoire that he could practice extensively beforehand. I'm not sure that would be appropriate for this venue, he stammered. William smiled, but it was not the warm expression the audience was used to seeing. On the contrary, I think it would be quite appropriate. After all, you've spent this evening questioning whether privilege can substitute for genuine training. Sight reading is perhaps the purest test of real musical education. The trap that Prince William had laid was becoming clear to everyone in the audience. He had not only demonstrated his own considerable abilities, but had also exposed the questionable claims of his challenger. Now he was offering a test that would definitively prove which of them possessed genuine musical training. As the full scope of the evening's revelations settled over the audience, people began to realize they were witnessing something historic. This wasn't just about one man's arrogance being answered by unexpected talent. This was about truth, authenticity, and the moment when real ability confronted false claims in the most public way possible. The Royal Albert Hall had become a pressure cooker of anticipation and tension. Viktor Kozlov stood frozen beside the grand piano, his face a mixture of panic and desperation as he realized the impossible situation he had created for himself. Prince William, meanwhile, remained calm and composed, holding the microphone with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Mr. Kozlov, William said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, I can see that you might be hesitant about a sight-reading demonstration. Perhaps I should explain why Professor Richter considered it so important. He turned to address the audience, his manner now that of a teacher rather than a royal. Professor Richter believed that sight-reading was the ultimate test of musical intelligence. Anyone can memorize pieces through repetition, but sight-reading requires instant comprehension of complex musical notation, immediate technical execution, and real-time musical interpretation. It cannot be faked. The audience listened with rapt attention as William continued. She used to say that sight reading separated true musicians from mere performers. A true musician could sit down with any piece of music and bring it to life immediately, without preparation or practice. Kozlov's discomfort was now painfully obvious. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the venue. His hands were trembling slightly, and his usual arrogant posture had collapsed into something approaching desperation. Your Royal Highness, Kozlov said, his voice barely above a whisper. Perhaps we should return to the program. But William was not about to let him escape so easily. Actually, I have an idea that might make this more interesting for our audience. He gestured to Sarah Lancashire, who approached with obvious curiosity and concern. Sarah, would you be willing to help us with something? William asked. Of course, Your Royal Highness, she replied, though her expression suggested she had no idea what she was agreeing to. William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his mobile phone. I'm going to call the Royal Academy of Music. They're just a few miles from here, and I happen to know that Professor James Crawford is working late tonight preparing for tomorrow's master class. The audience watched in amazement as William actually dialed a number. This evening had already gone so far beyond normal protocol that anything seemed possible now. Professor Crawford? William's voice was clearly audible through the hall's excellent acoustics. It's William. Yes, I'm at the Albert Hall for the charity gala. I need a rather unusual favor. Could you possibly scan and email some sight reading exercises to the venue's technical team? Yes, pieces that neither Mr. Kozlov nor I could have seen before. Something challenging, but not impossible. Perfect. The technical team will project them onto screens so the audience can see as well. Thank you so much. He ended the call and turned back to the stunned audience. Professor Crawford is going to send us some pieces that neither Mr. Kozlov nor I have ever encountered before. They'll be projected on the screens around the hall so everyone can follow along as we play. The implications were staggering. This would be the most public test of musical ability in royal history, broadcast live on television to millions of viewers. There would be nowhere to hide, no possibility of preparation or deception. Kozlov looked as if he might faint. Your Royal Highness, surely this is unnecessary. On the contrary, William replied firmly. I think it's exactly what this evening needs. You've spent considerable time questioning the relationship between privilege and talent. Let's settle the question definitively. Within minutes, the Albert Hall's technical team had received the files from the Royal Academy of Music and was preparing to project them onto the large screens positioned around the venue. The audience buzzed with excitement and anticipation, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. Sarah Lancashire, still holding her microphone, seemed to have found her footing again. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to witness what I believe is the first royal sight reading competition in British history. The screens around the hall flickered to life, displaying the title page of a musical score, Ballade in a Minor, by an unknown contemporary composer. The piece had been specifically chosen because it would be unfamiliar to both pianists while still being within the technical range of accomplished players. Mr. Kozlov, Williams said, as our guest artist this evening, perhaps you would like to go first? Kozlov approached the piano bench with the reluctance of a man walking to his execution. He sat down and looked up at the nearest screen, his face pale and drawn. The piece was clearly visible to everyone in the hall, a complex work with intricate rhythms, challenging harmonies, and multiple musical themes woven throughout. The pianist placed his hands on the keys and began to play. From the very first measures, it was clear that something was wrong. His usually fluid technique was hesitant and uncertain. He stumbled over several passages, his timing was inconsistent, and his interpretation lacked any real musical understanding. The audience watched in uncomfortable silence as Kozlov struggled through barely 2 pages of the score before stopping completely. His hands were shaking, and sweat was now clearly visible on his face. I need a moment to study this more carefully, he said, his voice barely audible. Of course, William replied graciously, though everyone in the hall understood what had just happened. Victor Kozlov, the internationally celebrated pianist, had failed the most basic test of musical training. Prince William then took his place at the piano. He looked up at the screen displaying the unfamiliar score and spent perhaps 30 seconds studying the opening page. Then, he placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The difference was immediately apparent. William's sight reading was fluid, confident, and musically intelligent. He navigated the complex rhythms with ease, his phrasing was natural and expressive, and his technical execution was flawless. Most remarkably, he was making musical sense of a piece he had never seen before, bringing it to life as if he had been practicing it for weeks. As he continued through the piece, the audience became increasingly amazed. This wasn't just competent sight reading, it was brilliant musical interpretation happening in real time. William was demonstrating the kind of musical intelligence and training that only came from years of serious study under world-class instruction. When he finished the piece, the silence that followed was pregnant with emotion. Then, the applause began, not the polite appreciation typically given to royal performances, but genuine admiration for exceptional musical ability. Kozlov remained seated at the side of the stage, his career and reputation crumbling around him. The man who had built his success on claims of superior training and natural ability had just been exposed as a fraud in the most public way possible. But William wasn't finished. He stood up from the piano and walked over to where Kozlov sat. Mr. Kozlov, he said, his voice now carrying a tone of authority that reminded everyone present that they were in the presence of the future King of England. I think it's time for some honesty this evening. He turned to address the audience directly. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed tonight raises important questions about authenticity in the arts. Mr. Kozlov is undoubtedly a talented pianist, but His claims about his training appear to be fabricated. The hall was completely silent as William continued. I've been contacted by several conservatories over the past year about inconsistencies in Mr. Kozlov's claimed educational background. Tonight's events have simply made those concerns public. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. But this evening isn't really about exposing fraud. It's about remembering why we're here, to support children in need. And it's about understanding that true talent, genuine ability, and authentic achievement are worth celebrating, regardless of someone's background or circumstances. William looked directly at Kozlov, who had now buried his face in his hands. I don't take pleasure in what's happened here tonight. But when someone uses false credentials to attack others and diminish their achievements, the truth has a way of revealing itself. The cameras that had been broadcasting the gala live were capturing every moment of this extraordinary confrontation. Millions of viewers were watching as one of classical music's most celebrated figures was revealed as a fraud, while the future King of England demonstrated musical abilities that nobody had known he possessed. Sarah Lancashire finally found her voice again. Your Royal Highness, I think I speak for everyone here when I say that this evening has been unprecedented. William smiled, the warmth returning to his expression. Indeed it has. But perhaps we can learn something from it. Real ability doesn't need to be propped up by false claims. Genuine talent speaks for itself. As the full implications of the evening's events began to sink in, the audience realized they had witnessed something that would be talked about for generations. This wasn't just a musical confrontation. It was a moment when truth triumphed over deception, when authentic ability confronted false pretense, and when the quiet dignity of real achievement silenced the empty boasting of a fraud. The stage was now set for the final act of this remarkable evening, as Prince William prepared to address not just the audience in the Royal Albert Hall, but the millions watching around the world who had just seen their future king in an entirely new light. The Royal Albert Hall had become a cathedral of silence. 5,000 people sat in absolute stillness, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Viktor Kozlov remained hunched over at the side of the stage, his career and reputation in ruins. Prince William stood beside the grand piano, no longer just the future King of England, but a man who had demonstrated grace under pressure and the kind of quiet strength that defines true leadership. The television cameras continued to roll, broadcasting this unprecedented moment to millions of viewers worldwide. Social media was exploding with clips, comments, and reactions as people shared what they couldn't quite believe they had seen. The hashtag Prince William Piano was already trending globally, with videos of his performance being shared thousands of times per minute. Sarah Lancashire approached Prince William with her microphone, her professional composure finally restored. Your Royal Highness, she said, I think our audience would love to know more about your musical background. This has obviously been a closely guarded secret for many years. William nodded thoughtfully, then gestured for Kozlov to join him at center stage. The disgraced pianist looked up with surprise and reluctance, but slowly made his way over. When they stood together, the contrast between them was stark. William emanating quiet confidence and dignity, Kozlov radiating shame and defeat. Mr. Kozlov, William said gently, his voice carrying through the hall. I want you to know that I take no pleasure in what's happened here tonight. You are genuinely talented, and that talent shouldn't be overshadowed by poor choices about how to present yourself. The audience watched in amazement as Prince William, who had every right to be angry and vindictive, instead showed compassion to the man who had tried to humiliate him publicly. But William continued, his voice becoming firmer. I hope this evening serves as a reminder that in our connected world, truth has a way of emerging. False credentials, exaggerated claims, and attempts to diminish others will eventually be exposed. He turned to address the audience directly. My mother taught me that music is a universal language that connects us all. She believed that someone in my position should understand what moves people's hearts and souls. Professor Richter continued that education, teaching me that music demands honesty from the performer, from the audience, and from those who claim to represent it. William paused, his eyes moving across the vast audience. I've kept my musical training private not out of shame, but because I believed it should remain separate from my public duties. Tonight has shown me that perhaps there's value in sharing all aspects of who we are. The emotion in the hall was palpable. Many people were wiping away tears, moved not just by the music they had heard, but by the character they had witnessed. This was leadership in its purest form, strength without cruelty, justice without vindictiveness, and truth delivered with compassion. Sarah Lancashire seized the moment. Your Royal Highness, would you be willing to play something else for us? Something that represents what music means to you personally. William looked out at the audience, then back at the piano. Actually, there is something I'd like to play. It's a piece that Professor Richter used to say revealed the soul of whoever played it. He walked back to the piano and sat down, his posture relaxed now that the confrontation was over. This is Chopin's Ballade No. 4 in F minor. It was the last piece Professor Richter taught me before she passed away. She said it required not just technical skill, but life experience and emotional maturity to play properly. As William began to play, the atmosphere in the hall transformed once again. This wasn't the sight-reading demonstration or the competitive challenge from earlier. This was pure musical expression, a man pouring his heart and soul into an instrument that had been his companion for over 2 decades. The ballade unfolded with breathtaking beauty and complexity. William's interpretation was mature, nuanced, and deeply personal. The piece seemed to tell a story of struggle and triumph, of loss and hope, of the journey from youth to responsibility. Every phrase was shaped with care, every dynamic carefully considered, every moment of silence as important as the notes themselves. As the piece progressed through its various sections, the audience was taken on an emotional journey. The technical demands were enormous: rapid scales, complex harmonies, intricate counterpoint. But William navigated them all with the ease of someone for whom they had become second nature. When he reached the final section, where Chopin builds to a powerful climax before ending with haunting simplicity, William's playing became transcendent. It was no longer just a performance. It was a communion between musician, instrument, and audience that lifted everyone present above the ordinary world. The last notes faded into silence, and for a long moment, nobody moved. The performance had been so powerful, so complete, that applause seemed inadequate. Then, slowly, people began to stand. One by one, then, in groups, then, en masse, the entire audience rose to their feet. The ovation that followed was unlike anything the Royal Albert Hall had ever witnessed. It wasn't just appreciation for technical skill or royal courtesy. It was recognition of genuine artistry, of a man who had revealed depths of talent and character that nobody had suspected existed. Prince William stood and bowed, clearly moved by the response. As the applause continued, he looked over at Viktor Kozlov, who was also applauding, tears streaming down his face. When the ovation finally began to subside, William took the microphone one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for this extraordinary evening. What began as a charity gala to support children in need has become something none of us expected. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Professor Richter used to tell me that music was my responsibility as much as my privilege. She said that those who have been given gifts, whether musical talent or any other kind, have an obligation to use them in service of others. William gestured toward the audience. Tonight, I hope we've raised not just funds for children who need our help, but awareness of how much we can accomplish when we approach each other with honesty, respect, and genuine appreciation for real talent and achievement. He looked directly into the television cameras. To those watching at home, I want you to know that this evening has reminded me why the arts matter so much. Music, literature, visual arts, they don't just entertain us. They reveal truth, challenge assumptions, and connect us to what's best in human nature. The audience listened in rapt silence as their future king spoke from the heart about subjects that clearly mattered deeply to him. Mr. Kozlov, Williams said, turning to the pianist, I hope you'll consider this evening not as an ending, but as a beginning. You have real talent. Use it honestly, and it will serve you well. Kozlov stepped forward, his voice barely audible as he spoke into the microphone. Your Royal Highness, I owe you and everyone here a profound apology. My behavior tonight was inexcusable, and my claims about my education were dishonest. You've shown me what real character looks like, and I'm deeply ashamed of my actions. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. The evening had clearly changed him as much as it had surprised everyone else. William extended his hand to Kozlov, who shook it gratefully. We all make mistakes, William said. What matters is what we learn from them. As the two men shook hands, the audience erupted in applause once more. This gesture of forgiveness and Redemption seemed to complete the evening's extraordinary journey from confrontation to revelation to reconciliation. Sarah Lancashire returned to center stage as Prince William and Victor Kozlov left together, talking quietly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "I believe we've witnessed something truly historic tonight. We came here to support children in need, and I'm pleased to announce that this evening's events have generated the largest single-night donation total in our organization's history." The announcement that the evening had raised over £2 million for charity seemed almost anticlimactic after everything else that had happened. But it served as a reminder of why everyone had gathered in the first place. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to file out of the Royal Albert Hall, the conversations were unlike any heard at previous royal events. People weren't discussing protocol or fashion or the usual social pleasantries. They were talking about truth, talent, character, and the power of music to reveal the essence of who we really are. In the days that followed, the story would be told and retold around the world. Victor Kozlov would eventually rebuild his career on a foundation of honesty, becoming an advocate for authenticity in classical music education. Prince William would occasionally perform at private charity events, though he would never again be challenged quite so dramatically. But the real legacy of that October evening was something deeper. In an age of social media performance and carefully curated public images, the world had witnessed something genuinely authentic. They had seen character tested under pressure, talent revealed through adversity, and grace demonstrated in victory. The silence that followed Prince William's final performance wasn't just appreciation for beautiful music. It was recognition that they had witnessed something rare and precious, a moment when truth triumphed over pretense, when real ability silenced false claims, and when the future King of England showed the world that true nobility comes not from birth, but from character.